Thank you, Tony. Good morning. My name is Jane Ford, and I'm the worship associate. And shortly, you're going to see behind me Kelly Brotzman, who's our worship leader for this morning. But first, Emily gave me a couple of announcements she wanted to make sure you all heard. First, tonight at 5 p.m. on Zoom, the governing board will be hosting an informational meeting on Zoom about the upcoming vote to authorize the church to apply for the employee retention credit. The vote on this will be held Sunday, February 19th after church. So come to the Zoom meeting at 5 p.m. tonight before the Super Bowl. And if you have any questions or want to learn more about this vote, check Thursday's newsletter for a link to the Zoom meeting and a full explanation of this vote. Next Friday, a more fun announcement in my opinion, there's going to be at February 17th, game night for all ages. Bring a board game to share, but also join us for a few rounds of bingo and pizza, and all are welcome to bring a snack or dessert. And the games, a lot of the games have been made by the kids. If you have any questions, ask Laura Sander and Coffee Hour today. Okay, now welcome. Welcome to First Parish Kingston. As I said, I'm the worship leader for this morning's service. We know you come here for different reasons: to find community, to seek your spiritual and personal truths, to question, to nurture your heart and soul, to be nurtured, to explore new ideas, to find comfort, and perhaps find the answer to some of your bigger questions. Whatever reason brought you here, we are happy to join us this morning. And now we will move to the chalice lighting. And as we begin our worship, we light our chalice to these words by Rebecca Savage. We light our flaming chalice as a beloved people, united in love and thirsting for restorative justice. This is a chalice of audacious hope. This chalice shines a light on our shared past, signaling our intention to listen deeply, reflect wisely, and move boldly towards our highest ideals. Now, please stand if you are willing. And now it's time for our pastoral prayer this morning. Spirit of life, God of love, hear this cry, which begins with gratitude for the human ability to take action to right the wrongs of our kin. If you're the force of love, be loving to those incarcerated people, for they are our kin. If you're the force of possibility, seed opportunity who believe that they have been forgotten. And if you are a larger freedom, break the chains of oppression and ignorance in which so many lives are bound. Now we'll have a brief silent meditation, which will begin with the bell and end with the bell. We will end our Candles of Community with part 2 of Love Be Your Guide. And now I welcome Kelly Brotzman, a member of our congregation, to give today's sermon. The offering. Oh, you know, I do that. No, but she wanted me to do, I forgot the offering. You know, I'm a former nonprofit fundraiser. You would think that would be the last thing I would forget, but oh well, thanks for reminding me. All right, when we give, we say yes to something we value. In this congregation, we take up an offering each week to say yes to the values of our UU faith and yes to this beloved community. Together, we use these gifts to serve with ever greater love. Please give as you are able. Today's offering will be gratefully received. I have to confess my sins. I have struggled all my life with perfectionism, and I thought I got over it. And last night, I'm reordering my notes for the service, and I got them backwards. I'm sure you'll forgive me. Now it's time for Kelly to do a reading, followed by the sermon.
Thank you, Jane. Today's reading is by Etheridge Knight. He was born in 1931, died in 1991. He was a central member of the Black Arts Movement, along with his spouse and fellow poet, Sonia Sanchez. Born in rural Mississippi, Knight dropped out of high school to fight in the Korean War. He returned badly wounded and struggled with a heroin addiction. He served 8 years at Indiana State Prison, where he began to write poetry. According to the Poetry Foundation, much of Knight's work looks for ways one can be free despite incarceration. This poem is most likely autobiographical. After explanations and regulations, he walked warily in. Black hair covered his chin, subscribing to villainous ideal. This cannot be real, he thought. This is a classical mistake. This is a cake baked with embarrassing icing. Somebody's got, likely as not, a big fat tongue in cheek. What have I to do with a prim and proper-blooded lady? Christ indeed has risen when a junkie in prison visits with a wasp woman. Hold your stupid face, man. Learn a little grace, man. Drop a notch, the sacred shield. She might have a good reason, like, I am in prison and ye visited me not, or some such. So sweep clear anachronistic fear, fight the fog, and use no hot words. After the seating and the greeting, they fished for a denominator, common or uncommon, and could only summon up the fact that both were human. Be at ease, man. Try to please, man. The lady is as lost as you. You got children, ma'am, he said aloud. The thrust broke the dam, and their lines wiggled in the water. She offered no pills to cure his many ills, no compact sermons, but small and funny talk. My baby began to walk, simply cannot keep his room clean. Her chatter sparked no resurrection, and truly no shackles were shaken. But after she had taken her leave, he walked softly, and for hours used no hot words. Good morning. It has been so rewarding for me to become more involved here at First Parish, and it was wonderful when Jane invited me to collaborate on today's service. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Worship Committee, and thank you, Jane. Today, I want to share some reflections on the first principle of Unitarian Universalism and tell you a little bit about a journey that I've been on for about 15 to 20 years now. A journey which has been animated primarily by this principle. You see, even though I'm still pretty new to Unitarian Universalism, I am not at all new to any of its core principles. I spent many years, too many probably, getting a PhD in social ethics, and then 20 more teaching ethics at the college level. People often ask me what ethics is, and I say, it's what you study if you're obsessed with thinking about how people should live. And social ethics is what you study when you're obsessed with thinking about how people should live together in community. The first principle of Unitarian Universalism, the inherent dignity and worth of every human person, is central to many of the world's great ethical traditions, modern and pre-modern, Western and Eastern. At times, I think the concept of human dignity is so familiar and so taken for granted that we lose sight of how truly radical it is and the enormous challenges it poses for social life. So let me try to unpack this seemingly simple but truly profound principle in 4 ways. First, dignity is more than just importance. It is infinite value. Things which have dignity have no fixed, finite, or quantifiable value, which can be compared to other valuable things and weighed against them. In this way, dignity confounds the concepts of worth or value that most of us operate with every day, which generally come from economics. Ordinary cost-benefit calculations are easy. You sum up the upsides or the advantages on one side, and you sum up the disadvantages or the downsides on the other side, and the greater of the two decides the matter. When dignity comes into the equation, however, things get complicated, because infinity is not subject to comparisons of greater than or less than. If something has dignity, there is literally nothing that is so valuable or important that it can be permitted to violate, injure, or despoil human dignity. Second, dignity doesn't disappear. The first principle contains the little word inherent. What does inherent mean? It means you don't earn it. It comes with you into the world. It isn't bestowed on you after the fact by other people. It is baked in to your humanity. To say that dignity is inherent in every human being is to say that there is nothing a human being can do to erase, nullify, or diminish their dignity. The third point I want to make about dignity is actually a corollary of the second. If dignity is inherent and not earned, then calculations about deservingness fall apart. People are not more or less deserving of dignified treatment. Everyone deserves it, and deserves it in the exact same amount, 100%. In this sense, dignified treatment isn't a reward that some get and others do not, either because they are better or because they occupy a special position. Fourth and finally, dignity makes demands. Dignity sets a moral standard for how we should live and interact with our fellow human beings. The fact that such a standard exists, of course, does not mean that it isn't regularly and massively violated. I happen to believe that a lot of things we begrudgingly tolerate as just part of life, or which we've learned to live with, are at root grotesque violations of human dignity. Things like rampant socioeconomic disparities, generational poverty, systemic racism, and more. But the fact that we're surrounded on all sides by so many perverse violations of human dignity doesn't mean that we should become numb to them or lower the rigorous standard that human dignity sets. It just means that we should see these things for what they are, moral emergencies that demand our urgent attention and determined resistance. So hopefully these aspects of dignity help illustrate that this first principle of Unitarian Universalism is not just some nice little platitude, but rather a bold and revolutionary moral commitment. Now I want to connect this principle to a world not many people know much about, the American prison system. I should clarify that I have no personal experience of being incarcerated myself. I wasn't hiding a secret from Bob when I met him. He didn't marry a former jailbird. But I have spent more time in American prisons than most people have, and I have done this on purpose and by choice, which I understand might seem a little odd to the average person. What is it that draws me to prisons and to people in prison? To answer that, I have to tell you a little about myself. I was raised in the heart of the moral majority. I was an 80s kid in a highly observant evangelical Christian family and a career military family to boot. Sacred things included not just the Bible, but also the American flag, Ronald Reagan, every fertilized egg that ever swam around in anyone's uterus, and the writings of Dr. Dobson, Phyllis Schlafly, and that whole crew. Evil things included cults, communists, and relativism, whatever that was. Now, mind you, I had walked a fairly long way from that background by the time I first entered a prison. Still, some things from your background are hard to shake. One moral touchstone that is still today very hard for me to shake is the rather vivid scene from Matthew 25 in the Christian New Testament, where someone called the Son of Man sits on a glorious throne and separates all the nations into two groups. The sheep get the good end of the deal, not because of anything they did for the Son of Man per se, but because of what they did for the least of these, the outcast, the powerless, those on the margins. You see, the sheep gave food to hungry people. They gave clothing to those without. They visited sick people and welcomed strangers. And they also conspicuously visited people in prison. The goats, well, they didn't do any of those things. And they got an eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. I'm mostly joking here, but I'm pretty certain that the eternal fire was no more than the rhetorical flourish of an ancient writer. But when I first got the idea of volunteering in a prison, at least part of my motivation was a version of the old child's game. Which one of these doesn't belong? Look at all the things the sheep do. Food to the hungry. Well, no one deserves to go hungry, and I had done my fair share of food pantry shifts and canned food drives. Clothing the naked, ditto, check. Visiting sick people, ditto, check. Welcoming strangers, ditto, check. But visiting people in prison? I had never set foot in or even near a prison. I never knew anyone who had gone to prison or jail, or even been arrested for that matter. Maybe one or two after a little too much college revelry. Plus, unlike the hungry, naked, sick, and strangers, hadn't people in prison done bad things to deserve to be there? But remember what I said before about deservingness. At any rate, I wanted to know why visiting people in prison was on this particular list. The other part of my motivation was that around this time, the late 90s and early 2000s, it was becoming fairly clear to many Americans, especially to those of us in the field of ethics, that our country had a teeny tiny little bit of a prison problem. I kid, we had a massive, growing addiction to imprisonment as the knee-jerk solution to every single social problem that exists. Between the early 80s and the late aughts, topping out around 2008, the number of people incarcerated in this country quintupled. Get your head around that. Fivefold in 30 years. Our rate of incarceration, people in prison or jail per 100,000 residents, soared well north of 900, well ahead of the next most imprisoned countries of Rwanda, El Salvador, Turkmenistan, and Cuba. Good company to be in. Furthermore, those who wound up in prison was far from random. The poor and people from low-income communities were disproportionately subject to more policing and more criminal charges. They were less likely to be represented by counsel in court proceedings and were likely to get harsher sentences than identical affluent people. Worst of all were, and still are, the patterned, grotesque racial disparities. White people are roughly 60 to 65% of the US population, but just 32% of the incarcerated population. By contrast, Black people are 12 to 13% of the US population, but 34% of the incarcerated population. So anyway, I had these two motivations. I was curious about why visiting people in prison was just as important as feeding hungry people, but I also had a growing concern, outrage, about the utter ridiculousness of mass incarceration in the United States. And I've always shared a conviction with one of my moral heroes, Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, and a crusading attorney and the author of the book Just Mercy, which inspired a film of the same name. Stevenson says, and I wholeheartedly agree, that if you want to understand a problem, you have to get proximate to the people affected by it. By proximity, Stevenson means real, no kidding, personal nearness. If I wanted to get my head around prison and mass incarceration, I needed to find a way to be in relationship with people in prison. I needed to find ways to get to know them, interact with them, and connect with them. I have done that in a great variety of ways. I started out making monthly visits to 2 people in 2 Massachusetts prisons who were pursuing their bachelor's degrees through Boston University's trailblazing prison education program. I got to know them both fairly well, and they were both successful in completing their college degrees, which is no small feat when you think about not having the internet and not having any research resources. Later on, I spent several spring semesters teaching inside-out college courses in a drab cinder block room at the end of the education hallway at a medium security prison in Virginia. Inside-out courses are so called because they co-enroll equal numbers of incarcerated and non-incarcerated students. Let me tell you that taking a bunch of largely affluent, white, preppy college kids into prison every day for class was quite the experience. I had a few phone calls from some parents that were not wild about this idea. I got to know my incarcerated students very well, as I do with all my students, and I get attached to them. Upon returning to Massachusetts 6 years ago, I participated in the Alternatives to Violence program, a wonderful program if you want to get involved, which is a weekend retreat of sorts that takes place in a prison. It's hard to think about a retreat that takes place in prison, but it's co-facilitated by incarcerated and non-incarcerated leaders. Today, in my current job as the director of the prison book program in Quincy, I am literally awash in personal communications from people in prison. Prison book program receives over 1,500 individual handwritten letters every month requesting reading materials. You'd be surprised how much you can connect with someone over their reading interests. After all of this involvement, and 18 years after stepping foot for the very first time into an American prison, I think I have my answer about why visiting people in prison was an important thing for the sheep to do. For most of us out here on this side of the prison walls, people in prison basically do not exist. I mean, unless you have a loved one who's incarcerated, who really stops to think about the people in there or what their lives are like? We can see the hungry, the homeless, the sick, the stranger. We see them at our stoplights with their signs, hungry, anything helps. We see their tent cities. If you've been to downtown Boston recently, you see the sick, those struggling with the terrible disease of addiction all around you. But people in prison are, by contrast, basically invisible. When was the last news report you heard from inside a prison? When was the last interview with a person in prison that you saw in mass media? To the extent that they are present to us at all, they are primarily present as an indistinguishable mass, criminals, and not as unique human persons. This invisibility is really weird when you consider what a large group of people we're talking about. Although we've seen a few modest reductions in recent years, there are still 1.9 million people in our country's prisons and jails. If you add them all up, they would be the country's 5th most populous city, just behind Houston at 2.3 million. Now imagine a whole city, just a little smaller than Houston, where all the people are invisible, and all the people from the other cities never go there. And as a result, no one knows anything about the people from this city. Their invisibility also means that their dignity is extremely easy to violate. At least those who are cruel to the hungry, the sick, and the stranger can usually be seen for what they are. By contrast, it is uncommonly easy to get away with abusing, exploiting, and degrading people in prison. I am sorry to report that this degradation is the very raison d'etre of today's prison system. Think about the most dehumanizing environment you can conjure and know it is worse than that. I am convinced, after many trips to prison, that the only social function the carceral system performs is to serve as a very large garbage can into which society can throw human beings to be rid of them. This disposability is not lost on incarcerated people, One man who writes to prison book program regularly said in one of his recent letters, "I sometimes feel as if I have been thrown away." It is not just that prisons fail to achieve or even aspire to any rehabilitative purpose. Depending on how you count, between 60 and 80% of people who leave prison will return in 5 years. It is an epic and highly expensive failure in this regard. It's more than that, though. It's that prison actively hobbles and undercuts the things that might actually help. I don't know about you, but one of the things that keeps me going day to day is the web of meaningful, positive, and caring connections within which I am fortunate to exist. One of the worst things that prison does to people, and it does a whole lot of truly terrible things, is that it systematically cuts the fibers that make up this web. It does this by design and on purpose. I once had a prison warden tell me that less than 10% of the people at his facility had a visitor ever, let alone a regular visitor. Phone calls are expensive and time limited. The cheapest way to communicate with someone in prison is through letter writing, but who really writes letters anymore? Except for Jane and Tony and the wonderful people of the Church of the Larger Fellowship. But it's really difficult to sustain important relationships, marriages, parent-child relationships with letters, short phone calls, and the occasional trek to a faraway fortress. If someone comes out of prison, especially after a longer sentence, with a web of supportive and caring relationships to surround them, there is some truly heroic love in play. I can guarantee you that. And the people in that web have triumphed over extraordinarily steep odds. The upshot of all this is that prisons are full to bursting with some of the loneliest people I have ever encountered. Another undignified thing about prisons is that they invariably reduce a complex human being to one thing and one thing only: their crime. Part of having dignity has to be permission to be many things, and also to grow and evolve as a person. The people I have met inside prison are similar to the people I meet outside of prison. They are complicated, interesting, and multifaceted. One of the funniest people I know is a man in prison. If he were a stand-up comedian, he would seriously have a Netflix hit. The single most gifted writer that I've ever taught was incarcerated. I know a gentleman who for decades played correspondence chess with incarcerated people. If you don't know what a correspondence chess is, you actually send the board back and forth in the mail and show where the pieces go. And he remarked that one of his incarcerated chess buddies was probably grandmaster level. But all of this variety and diversity isn't recognized or celebrated when it comes to people in prison. To prison officials and to many of us in the general public, people in custody are one thing and one thing only: offenders. They don't even have names. They exist as numbers. This reduction continues when a person is released. Today's scarlet letter is a felony conviction. With one, it is nearly impossible to get a job or find housing, let alone achieve the loftier things that make life good for most of us: making friends and finding supportive communities and so on. One of the main things that draws me to people in prison is the surprisingly large portion of people in there who have undertaken the difficult, slow, and courageous work of healing themselves. I have so many stories of people, and I hold them in my heart, who have dedicated themselves to personal transformation, using any resources they can to look within and to examine the pain that they carry and the pain that they have caused, to seek reconciliation and to become fundamentally new, different people. People who are responsible and people who contribute to the healing journeys of others. Those who go on these redemptive journeys inspire me because they are the protagonists of their own stories. The system within which they exist neither recognizes nor rewards them for it. They become new people not because of their environment, but in spite of it. If more people out here would pursue the same kind of intentional, transformative agenda, I think our world would look a lot different than it does. What I see when I see people who have, for all intents and purposes, been thrown away by society, remake themselves in this way, is dignity. I see people who, against strong countercurrents, keep the little flame of their own dignity and worth lit. I see people who can be a tremendous witness to all of us about why every single human life does indeed have immeasurable and inherent value, and why no human being is ever disposable. For me, at least, being connected to people like this has been ennobling. It has made me a better person and pushed me to do more to protect and honor human dignity everywhere. May those whose dignity is most precarious inspire all of us to defend it and to insist that no one is expendable.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I know a little bit about the system, maybe 1% of what she does, and I'm so grateful that she chose to share that with us and also to be a part of our community. Before we do our closing hymn, let me just remind you that today's our annual chocolate auction. So don't fight each other across the street, walk in the crosswalk, but please join us, everyone, across the street at Beer House after we do our closing hymn and benediction. And the closing hymn is I Wish I Knew How, which is number 151 in the gray hymnal.